I'm going to ask you to go back and read, please be seated, to the court, the testimony beginning it would be the questions and the answers beginning with the self-defense issues.
And the one right before that, Your Honor, was when I asked him about that he investigates crimes. And I think that was.
Well, I think it goes further beyond that. That's what I'm asking for.
I'll start with a page on that back. Okay, would you agree that any of the slight inconsistencies that did exist on a video, you would sort of assign as just being the way interviews go? Answer, perhaps yes. Question, well, anything else besides that? Answer, not that comes to mind, no, as far as something that would have triggered something more than just continuing to talk to him. Question, because at this point, you had fairly specific evidence that Mr. Zimmerman was acting in self-defense that night, correct? Answer, I had information that would have supported that, yes, sir. Question, well, you had his injuries for one, correct? Answer, correct. Question, that certainly fits into your formula, did it not? Answer, yes. Question, you had a bunch of witness statements, including John Good, correct? Answer, yes, sir. Question, and that fits into the self-defense theory that you were looking into, right? Answer, yes. Question, part of your job is to investigate crime, right? I mean, pretty much most of what you do. Answer, yes, sir. Question, and in the context of investigating crime, you also by nature have to investigate the existing defenses, right? Answer, absolutely. Question, you are charged with the responsibility of looking at an event like this and understanding whether or not self-defense exists. And there was the objection.
Okay, I think that you're getting very close to the motion in limine that was ruled upon by this court. So,
I would ask if this question be allowed to be answered, and then I will move on.
Okay. So the objection to anything further would be sustained. You may finish with this one question and then move on. This is Mr. Daly.
I suggested a moment ago with the timing, if you wanted to address that now. I don't think that I'm going to finish anytime very soon with this witness, so your call as to whether or not we stop now, because they're out already, and then just come back in the morning.
I'm going to ask the jury how far they want to go, if they want to go until 6 o'clock, because it's 5:25. And so let's go ahead and bring the jury back in. Yes.
jury's present, Your Honor.
Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not going to finish with Officer Sereno tonight. I wanted to get some kind of feel from you as to how late you wanted to stay. If we stayed till 6 o'clock, would that be too much for you? No. Okay. You may proceed.
The last question I'm just going to restate, so it's not going to be exact, but we were talking about what you do as a law enforcement officer to investigate crime, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in investigating crimes, you also have the charge or the responsibility to look into whether or not defenses exist, such as self-defense.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that was just a continuing sort of overview that you have in all cases.
Yes, sir.
So now let's move forward. And I think you said earlier there was nothing specifically inconsistent with the statements before and the recreation video, correct?
No, sir.
Okay. Now let's just sort of move forward into your next efforts in this regard. I'm going to then move us up pretty quickly to the next interview with Mr. Zimmerman. But before you got to that next interview with Mrs. Zimmerman, tell the jury, if you would, what other actions you were doing as the investigating officer.
From the beginning?
Well, we sort of gone through the 26th, correct, that night, and then we've talked about that you had a dozen or so witness statements you had already gathered on the 27th, and that we had the interview and the recreation interview on the 27th. So moving us from that point forward.
Okay, other than identifying Trayvon himself, and as far as my timeline, as far as what I was doing, as far as as it pertains to George.
Yes, sir.
Okay. On the day after, after identifying, well, on the day of the incident, I spent several hours attempting to identify Trayvon, and I spent most of the night doing that, actually. And after identifying him, I had to go ahead and make arrangements to get him released. The interviews that were conducted in preparation for my next interview with George had to be listened to, compared to with a written statement that he provided us. Correct. Okay. And ultimately, you know, not to consolidate it for you, but we had to essentially. We realized that the only person that saw what happened or how it initiated was going to be George, because at that point we couldn't find any other witnesses to say how it began, what was the first encounter.
Right. And if I might, I don't want to interrupt you just for a moment, and then I want to go back on that track. Mm-hmm. At this point, you did have available to you the non-emergency call, correct?
Yes, I did.
So you did know what Mr. Zimmerman was saying to the non-emergency operator at that point, and you also had Ms. Lauer's 911 call where you heard the screaming, correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so with that in context, you were telling us sort of now you're trying to figure out no other witnesses there who can say, I saw them come together.
We could not locate anybody who could say that they saw that exactly. All we had were the 911 calls and the yells in the background, statements from Mr. Good, who actually saw, no reason not to believe him, statements that your client made that corroborated everything else. And that's where we were on that last interview. I had nothing of substance to basically toss at him, to confront him with as far as the interview went, other than suspicious lack of remembering the streets, how many streets he had in his neighborhood, and other oddities, but that would have compelled me to go ahead and keep on interviewing him. So it just didn't quite add up, but would have had to have been further.
So then what you decided to take on, which is another useful police tactic, if you will, is what's called a challenge interview, correct?
At this point, I wasn't ready for one, but yes.
Right. I mean, that was, you were also under quite a deal of pressure to get this case moved forward, correct?
Yes, I was.
And had to move even quicker than you would otherwise have moved on this case because of some of the external pressures that we now know existed in this case.
Yes, sir.
And it was for that reason then that you may have moved a little bit quicker than you otherwise would like to interview Mrs. Zimmerman in sort of this aggressive context, correct?
Yes.
And I'm not saying that as though it's bad when I say
No.
it's aggressive. You're taught how to do this, correct?
Yes.
You're also taught, for example, as a law enforcement officer, how to use a command voice in a situation when you walk in, right? If you need to take control of a couple of people or whatever it is, anything it is, they teach you how to take control, and that is get in their face a little bit, wake them up, use a loud voice, because it works, right?
Yeah, assertiveness, if properly used, is effective.
And you also learn how to use all your weapon systems, so we know when to use what and how to use it and how to get control. And that's what you do as a cop, right?
Yes, sir.
And you get that both from the academy and you get it from years of experience.
Yes,
And one
sir.
of those things that you get from those years of experience is what I've called a challenge interview. I don't know if you have a different term for it, but is that what it is?
Don't have a name for it, but it's basically
Yeah.
a challenge
And
interview.
that's where you go in and you try to undermine a interviewee's story to them, right? Where you challenge them, you sort of, we go back and forth with first you being nice and you're not being nice, and you set them up and then you knock them down, correct?
That's a technique.
And I don't mean to give up your secrets, but
No,
I mean,
not at all. I mean, it's...
these are techniques, the purpose of which is to see if you can break somebody's story, right?
And to discover truth, yes.
Yeah. Particularly in a case of this where you're under a lot of pressure from the outside and don't have a lot of inconsistencies that you need to either get through to Mr. Zimmerman in this case and break it or not, correct?
The compound question.
Did you understand what I said?
Repeat it, please.
Sure. Your intent in this case, because of everything that was going on, was that you wanted to get Mrs. Zimmerman in a position where if you could break him, if you could get him to change his story in a significant way, then you can find out he's lying, right?
Correct.
That's one of them, right?
Yes, sir.
At the very least, what you do is you try and crack that door open a little bit, right? Get just a stream of light coming through so that you can really push through it if he's lying to you.
Yeah, I'm seeking, the omission that may be there, the exaggeration that may be there.
Yeah.
Just,
Or the anger that may be there that he didn't show before, or just the hit him with something that you might even exaggerate as a problem just to see if he bites, right? Someone like Officer Singleton, because she had a decent relationship with George from that first interview, right?
Yes,
So
sir.
she's the perfect candidate.
Could be, yes.
Might even help that they had that little Christian connection thing going on and all that, right?
Yes, sir.
And again, it sounds like I'm harassing your style or something. Please
No, not at
understand
all.
I'm not. I just want to make sure the jury understands that these type of techniques are used for very particular purposes within law enforcement,
Yes, sir.
right? And your purpose is not just to harass Mr. Zimmerman, but it's really your effort to figure out what really happened that night and what inconsistencies you might be able to exaggerate or whatever to try and get him to the point where he may tell you something he hasn't told you yet,
Yes, sir.
right?
Yes.
And that's going to tell you one thing or the other, right? It's either going to tell you that you got him, right? And
Yes.
and that will lead down some other path, right?
Yes.
Or it may confirm that he's, for the most part, telling you the truth,
Yes, sir.
right? So, and that is the context that we're working with this challenge interview, is it not?
Yes, sir.
And that was the whole purpose of setting it up the way you set it up, and where and when you set it up, and with whom you set it up?
Not specifically intended for that, but we didn't plan a challenge interview. It was just another interview. There could have been more, but I was, it wasn't as formatted as that, but yes, that's usually the way it turns out to be.
Well, I don't want to misspeak. Are you now, you're not suggesting that your intent here wasn't to challenge him as best you can to see if you can break him, right?
I was gentle. The challenge, when you say challenge interview, I'm thinking more, if I have something to challenge him with, at this point, I'm still not quite ready to challenge him, yeah.
Well, for example, you start the interview out by saying, you've heard of Murphy's Law, right?
Correct.
This person was not doing anything bad. You don't know the person of the name of the person that died, right? First of all, without going further into anything at all, but you were just going to present Mr. Martin as good as you can to Mr. Zimmerman for that same type of challenge interview style, right?
I didn't know anything other than that about Mr. Martin, so that was a baseline saying that. I just wouldn't consider a complete challenge interview in that context.
And again, that's why you would mention his name in the interview, making sure that you reminded George of his name to sort of personalize the passing of somebody.
Absolutely.
And again, that's sort of a bit of a psychological move just to, again, try and get George set for the fact that further on into the interview, you're going to start challenging him on things.
Yes, sir, but like I said, I didn't have much to challenge him with.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
But that was the intent, right?
Not necessarily, but it was one of the... When you say intent, are you talking sole intent?
No.
Okay, then it wasn't intent. Okay.
Yeah, I don't mean... You want to get more information from him, too.
Right? There was a lot of information I didn't have to challenge him with. But yes, that's one of the intentions behind that interview.
You would agree that the style of this interview, as we've just heard it, is a more aggressive style of interview that you took on because you want to get some information from Mr. Zimmerman to challenge him on what he knew and didn't know, right?
You could say that, yes.
Will you say that?
It was more challenging than the first interview.
Okay.
But on the scale of challenging interviews, it was mild.
You've had challenge interviews that were much more in the person's face, correct?
Usually when I had something more than what I had.
And I was just going to say, that's where you walk into the guy who just,
Exactly.
stole 8 cars in the neighborhood, and you have his fingerprints on 6 of them, and he's just telling you that he was in the library studying. Right?
Correct.
So that's that challenge interview is you walk in and go, you got one last chance. You're going to prison for a long, long time, or you're telling me what happened. And that's a real aggressive challenge interview, correct?
Yes, sir.
So you have to modify the challenge interview style based upon what it is you actually have to hit him with.
Exactly.
And in this case, you didn't have much to hit him with, right?
No, sir, I did not.
Okay. So you sort of walk him through everything that he had done. Now, the reason why you're having him repeat everything in greater detail is, again, to see if you can wean out any inconsistencies from him, right?
Or omissions, yes.
Or omissions, yes. He may just break down and say something that he didn't acknowledge before.
Admission, omissions, yeah, I was talking about stuff I might have left out.
Admission.
So,
Okay.
more information.
And as to the information, in the first few pages, anything else that he added that he had not talked to you about, at least in general terms?
No, sir.
Anything inconsistent?
Nothing major.
Then you start with, again, some of the sort of psychological underplay with him that he's going to be under a lot of scrutiny, right? You're trying to go to bat for him. You're going to have to speak for him, right? That you're sort of laying that into the framework here?
In this particular case, he could have been considered a victim also. It's one of those investigations where...
Agreed, but you were dealing with a lot going on that impacted on your investigation, correct?
Regardless of what was going on, I still kept an open mind that he could be a victim.
Okay. And in focusing him on some of what you thought you might have to defend when you were saying that you'd have to speak for him and it's going to be under a lot of scrutiny, this whole question of whether or not George profiled him that you mentioned, right?
Yes.
And you sort of hit him with that pretty straight out of the box, right? Hoping maybe for a response that would give you an insight as to whether or not he was profiling Trayvon because Trayvon was black?
More of an explanation, I was seeking.
Okay. So you asked him if he had been white, would you have reacted the same way? And he said yes.
Yes, sir.
Did that cause you any concern?
No.
Think he was being straightforward?
Yes.
Any evidence in your investigation to suggest differently up
No.
to that point? But you would agree that that was sort of something you want to play out there for him to respond to see if that might open something up?
There were external concerns about that, and I needed to get that clarified.
Okay. And you did?
Yes, I did.
And had he had that question gone somewhere else, that may have led you down a different path?
Yes, sir.
You also had a concern that you evidenced to him or sort of challenged him on because you had an issue of whether or not his rendition of getting hit dozens of times were supported by the forensic evidence of his injuries, correct?
In my view, yes.
Yeah.
They were lacking.
Yeah, because he said, I think one of you questioned him, and he said, I got hit 20, 25 times, right?
I believe he said 25 to 30 times.
25 or 30. It didn't seem as though there was injuries sufficient to somebody getting hit 25 or 30 times, right?
No, it did not.
Okay. As you mentioned earlier, the trauma that he had been through, do you believe in your investigation of him that it may have just felt like he was getting hit 25 or 30 times?
Based on personal experience, it could be a panic thing more. Yes, it very well could have been.
Okay. So that in and of itself was an area that was a concern of yours, correct, but not something that suggested that he was just making that story up, did it?
No.
Matter of fact, have you had a chance to look at the pictures of his injuries before they started healing when you saw him?
Yes, I did.
Okay, those are the injuries that were taken at SPD, Stanford Police Department, that night?
Yes.
Without having you go through each and every one, the jury's seen them now probably 3 or 4 times. Would you agree that there were numerous different bruisings and injuries on both sides of his scalp first?
There were injuries.
Okay.
However, based on the way I'd view him as a major crimes investigator who's seen injuries a lot worse than that, I didn't consider them life-threatening.
Of course. Matter of fact, we
Once
don't,
again.
and we don't need to see life-threatening injuries, do we?
No.
Okay. We don't need to see any injuries, do we?
No, we don't.
Yeah, he did have some.
Yes, he did.
And he had the nose injuries we talked about, and he had the lacerations on the back. You saw those pictures, right?
Yes, sir.
And he did see, you saw the bruisings or the swelling on both sides of his head. Did you see those?
I saw imperfections. You can call it that, yes.
Yeah, some what they call punctate bruising, like cement bruising on the...
Bumps, contusions, yeah.
Okay. And to the extent that you don't recount them all here today, agree that the jury can simply look at those pictures that were available to you at Stanford Police Department, taken really right around the time of the first midnight interview, and rely on those rather than your memory?
Yes.
But still, in your mind, it was questionable to you why he thought he was getting hit 25 or 30 times.
I was being subjective, trying to, yes, it was.
Yeah. And that was, did you finish? I'm sorry.
I'm good enough.
Okay, and that was one of the sort of subjects you focused on to see if you can move him a little bit?
Perhaps, yes.
You also sort of questioned him a number of different ways in this challenge interview on the following, and whether or not he was following him down the pathway or just getting out of the car. He was pretty consistent with you, right, that he did follow him, right, to begin with.
Yes.
He acknowledged that, never denied that, did he?
I think at one point he said he got out behind him, and I just clarified that it was in fact a follow, but it was the same thing. He said this. He said the same thing.
Okay. And then there was this question about why he didn't simply acknowledge to Trayvon Martin who he was or what he was doing, correct?
Yes.
And you questioned him in a couple of different ways on that as well.
Yes.
Did his answer to you satisfy you?
Not necessarily.
Tell me what your concern was.
He had made reference to mentoring children, specifically African American children. Why it didn't occur to him to go ahead and try to say something to somebody he was following.
Sure. In hindsight,
Of course.
that might have resolved things.
Absolutely.
And there are actually probably 1,000 decisions in hindsight that would have changed the outcome of this event, right?
But specifically, as far as my interview with him, that was a concern.
That was a concern. And what he said to you, and referring to the tape, was, why didn't you, was it fear, precaution, safety, all the above? Tell me what's going through your head. And he said, I didn't want to confront him. That wasn't my job.
Correct.
Did that seem a reasonable explanation to you?
I took it at that, yes. Yes.
You also challenged him on the question about some of the timing, about when Trayvon Martin was near the car, when he wasn't, whether or not he'd come back towards the car or not, correct?
I believe that was while he was going back to his truck. George was. Zimmerman, your client. He was. I questioned about the timing that took him to get back to his vehicle.
Okay. Yeah, because you were wondering why it might take 80 seconds if he was at the T intersection, why it would take 80 seconds to walk back to his car?
Yes, it seemed that there was a pause somewhere in there.
Yeah, and he said to you...
It seemed there was a pause in there somewhere, like he paused. It seemed like there would be a pause in there because of his time.
Right, because there was about 80 seconds that you wanted to at least have him explain to you, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in context, he explained it to you by saying, that was when I'd actually walked all the way over to my street, Retreat View Circle, which was those 40, 50, 60, we'll look at it, feet or so, to Retreat View Circle past the T, correct?
I don't recall his responses, but I was measuring from Retreat View Circle to his vehicle, and I'd have to listen to it again, but it just seemed excessive. There was a time there, but I do think that he did say that he actually paused to pick up his flashlight or something.
To pick up?
His flashlight, somewhere in there.
Again, we'll sort of defer to the tape as
Okay.
far as exactly what was said back and forth during this interview. Another effort that you did, a sort of significant one, was when you told him that Trayvon Martin would videotape a lot of what he was doing, and that you believed that this whole event may well have been on video.
Yes, sir.
Correct?
Yes, sir.
Again, a very specific challenge interrogation technique, is it not?
Yes, sir.
When you can say, you know, there's that bank just across the street and they had just installed brand new cameras, night cameras, color cameras, and we got real good video. And the reason for doing that is because that's truly an attempt to let this guy know, whoever it is, that you got him, right?
That can serve a lot. That's more of a bluff.
Sure.
In this one, to say that I got him, that's, that's just to put in his mind that
Right.
everything may or may not be there.
And I apologize, I spoke about two different events. This one
Okay.
specific event and then some guy across the street from a bank, so let me clear that up.
Okay.
Generally speaking, you might introduce the suggested existence of video evidence in order to flush out a true story.
Yes.
And in this particular case, that's what you were doing.
Yes, sir.
And you had suggested to Mrs. Zimmerman that there was a really good chance that Trayvon Martin's phone, which you had in your possession, but it was dead, the phone was dead and you couldn't really get it out yet, but that was a really good chance that was going to have a video of this whole event.
Yes, sir, I did.
And that was, in effect, to get him to, if there was something to come clean to, that he would come clean to it.
Yes, sir.
Knowing, as you said, that if it's there and it shows something you didn't tell us about, it's going to be really bad for you.
Yes, sir.
And that was the way you said it, right?
Yes, sir.
And that was the reason why you said it, right?
Yes, sir.
And that was all part of your challenge interview.
Yes, sir.
And what did he say when you told him that?
I believe his words were, "Thank God." I was hoping somebody would videotape it.
What indication did him saying to you, "Thank God, I really hope somebody videotaped it," what did that indicate to you?
In my opinion, would have been truth.
As to what the defendant was thinking or not?
No. I'm sorry. I got to stop doing that, and I apologize, Your Honor.
The question was, what did that indicate
To
to
him.
him?
Correct.
To Officer Serino?
That was my question.
Okay. Your
What the
objection?
defendant was thinking, I think the question was, maybe I
No,
misunderstood.
it's the indication from that response. What did that indicate to Officer Serino? So overruled.
You want me to rephrase the question?
Please.
Sure. The fact that George Zimmerman said to you, "Thank God, I hope somebody did videotape the event or the whole event," his statement, what did that indicate to you?
Either he was telling the truth, or he was a complete pathological liar, one of the two.
Okay. Now let's look at overall. Was there anything else in this case where you got the insight that he might be a pathological liar?
No.
Matter of fact, everything he had told you to date had been corroborated by other evidence that you were already aware of in the investigation that he was unaware of.
Correct.
Okay, so if we were to take pathological liar off the table as a possibility just for the purpose of this next question, you think he was telling the truth?
Yes.
Six. This is a good break.
I think it is, Your Honor. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to recess for the evening before I send you off. I'm going to give you my instructions again. You're not to discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anybody else. Excuse me. You're not to read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case. You're not to use any type of an electronic device to look on the internet. Anything having to do with this case, people, places, things, or terminology. And finally, you're not to read or create any emails, text messages, Twitters, tweets, or blogs, or any social networking pages about the case. Do I have your assurances that you will abide by these instructions? Yes. Okay, please put your notepads face down on the chair and follow Deputy Jarvis. Have a good evening. Please be seated. Officer Serino, we're going to recess, and of course you're free to go about your personal business, but we're going to start again tomorrow at 9 a.m. And you're not to discuss your testimony with anybody. That includes the attorneys, because effectively you're still on the stand. Thank you. Is there anything that we need to take up from either side before we recess for the evening?
No, Your Honor.
State? Okay, thank you. Court will be in recess till 9 a.m.